Okay, again, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music's new free monthly web series called Conversations with Our Curator. I'm Melissa Ziobro, the curator, and tonight finds me in conversation with talented educator and noted Beatles scholar Ken Womack. If you're not familiar with the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music at Monmouth University in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey, we preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. We are his official repository. And we also celebrate the history of American music and its diversity of artists and genres with our archival collection, exhibits, programming, and more. We are currently in the midst of planning for a brand new 30,000 square foot facility, which will be on Monmouth University's campus. You can see more about our work at springsteenarchives.org. So on to tonight's program. Again, this is a free, really informal web series that will feature researchers and writers who are exploring new perspectives in music history. These talks may or may not relate to Bruce Springsteen, right? Because we are, after all, also the Center for American Music. So after some initial questions from me, we will segue into audience Q&A. And I often think that's the best part. So tonight, as I noted, we are here with Ken Womack. Ken is one of the world's leading authorities on the Beatles and their enduring cultural influence. We'll be discussing his latest book, Living the Beatles Legend, the Untold Story of Mal Evans. So Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
So lovely to be here with you and really enjoy this series. It's such a wonderful addition to the offerings, not only of the Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music, but also the university.
Awesome. Thank you. So before we dive into the book, I always like to ask our guests a little bit about their backgrounds. So where did you grow up?
I grew up outside of Houston, Texas, in a place called Kingwood, a planned community. And I suppose we might call it like living in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Were you super into music as a kid? I always see guitars behind you, but I can't recall if I've ever seen you play.
You probably haven't seen me play. I do on occasion play demonstrations in my classes on either Springsteen or the Beatles, but um, I was a musician as a kid. I was in band. I played the trumpet, the French horn, the baritone, and I began picking up, your standard sort of rock instruments, keyboards, guitars, drums. I still enjoy playing the drums whenever I can. But it, I was into music in the sense I enjoyed playing it, but it was an entirely different situation when I discovered the Beatles.
Mm. Well, you mentioned when you discovered the Beatles. So tell us, when did you discover the Beatles?
Sure, it was in 1977. I'm not obviously a first generation fan, and they had interrupted my favorite television show that I would watch every morning while eating my cereal, and suddenly the my favorite show was gone. In fact, it had been canceled, as I later learned. And in its place was the Beatles cartoons, if you remember those mid-60s cartoons. And they're really quite awful. They're not well made. I think two guys voiced all four of them. But what made the difference for me was the music. I had not really heard it before, and it was arresting, as it is for the kids who discovered the Beatles, this hour. Quite frankly, it was quite an experience, and I think it's one that has obviously been shared by probably billions of people at this point. And what was interesting about it wasn't just this kind of fan fascination, because I've never been fanish. You don't see memorabilia necessarily around my office here. But instead, it was my parents. My father worked right across the street from the Houston Public Library in downtown Houston. And when I became interested in them, He bought me a greatest hits album that was from Germany, and he also went across the street and picked up the small handful of books about the Beatles. So I had this sort of scholarly approach right back there in 1977.
I love that. That is so fascinating. And while we're on the topic of your scholarly approach, I've noted that you're a prolific author, but you are also a full-time educator who has won many awards for your work in the classroom. How many years in the classroom do you have?
Oh gosh, well, um, let's see. I guess at this point it's 27 years
Okay.
I've been teaching full time. And it's the best thing we do, right? You're one of my most esteemed colleagues, and I know you feel the same way. I mean, it's what makes everything worthwhile is the transferal of knowledge and the creation of new knowledge, etc. Um, I can't get enough of it. I should be working on various books that I owe to a number of presses, but what did I do today? I was tinkering with my slides for some of my classes because I can't turn it off.
I love that. When I moved from the Department of History and Anthropology to be the curator of the Springsteen Archives this August, it was critical to me that I still be allowed to teach at least one class because I did not want to leave our students. I
Right. And
wanted to ask
we even
you,
had a conversation about that.
yes, I wanted to ask you though about your time in the classroom because I'm curious. How do you think that your teaching impacts your writing?
Oh, I think there's a tremendous amount of fluidity between those two aspects, right? What I found more and more over the years is a stronger drive to ensure that I'm even more current than maybe I planned to be when I was much younger, right? We all want to be current and contemporary in our work in terms of scholarship, but in recent years, I felt an even stronger drive to bring experience to the students, and this Mal Evans project is no different. One of my most important collaborators was Mal's son Gary, who is in his early 60s, and we did a bit of traveling in support of this book last fall, and Gary came to my classes, and so I made sure that when we had that opportunity, we embedded him in the class so that he could be part of their learning, and the students loved it. Um, uh, it was very powerful.
I'm so glad you brought up Gary because I want to ask you more questions about him shortly. But before we do that, now that everybody's gotten to know you just a little bit, give us the elevator pitch of the new book, if you will. Some folks on this webinar tonight have undoubtedly read the book already. Everyone who hasn't is going to go out and order it immediately after they get off this Zoom, I am sure. So give us the elevator overview of your book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans.
Well, it's probably a misnomer, that title. The story of Mal had been told several times, just completely incorrectly and without any kind of facticity. So the elevator pitch was, this is Mal Evans had an insider's view of the Beatles phenomenon. Really prior to its inception, they'd barely been the Beatles, maybe a year when he met them in 1961. And, the elevator pitch was you will see imagery and learn anecdotes about what it was like to be inside that storm. Essentially, they all invented their jobs, right? The Beatles were inventing the job of being a rock star. Mal was inventing the idea of what a road manager was, what it was like to steer those tours around the world. And then what happens when a band devotes its energies to being inside the studio exclusively? Mal had to learn what that meant. Would there be a place? And of course there was.
Now, I'll go back to Mal's son, Gary, who you just mentioned earlier. He writes the foreword to your book. He was just 14 when his dad died at the age of 40, right?
Hmm.
You also worked with Mal's daughter, with his sisters, and other family members. They allowed you unprecedented access to his personal archive, correct?
That's right.
So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the dynamics of working with the family, right? I have to imagine, I mean, I know from my own experience, it's a little different when you're working with the family than if you were writing about someone who died 400 years ago and, none of their descendants are around. I mean, did that complicate the process at all for you? Did it ever put you in any tough positions?
It didn't, and there really is not a single occasion when it did. I imagined that would be a problem early on, but it proved not to be. They had come to me, Gary did, and said, "Would you tell my father's story?" I, of course, knew and loved Mal like all Beatles aficionados, but I hadn't necessarily been driven to write about the guy. I was curious about the truth about how he had died because it was under such mysterious circumstances and other sorts of issues. But I didn't have necessarily, a rage to know that much more about him. Um, One of my first questions to Gary when we began working on this, right around the beginning of COVID, is there really all of this stuff? Because the great rumor in the world of Beatledom was that Mal had amassed this material and and that it had somehow disappeared. And Gary said on our first Zoom call, he said, "Yeah, oh, it's real." And then he said, "Do you want to see it?" And I said, "Well, yeah, got to write this story." And he sent a bulk of it, much of it digitized so I could work with it easier. Um, it's here in New Jersey within a week or so.
Mm.
Uh, and My wife Janine and I opened it up and we couldn't believe what we were seeing. I mean, at first I thought, well, this is just not going to be a revelation. Come on. Maybe I'm a little cynical, but we opened it up and, we would see pictures. And of course, Mal was a diarist, and there were hundreds of pages of diaries and that sort of material. And it was pretty revelatory. I mean, there's a reason why folks, I guess, were calling it this sort of holy grail of the Beatles story. Um, and I probably haven't found everything in it yet. There's just so much. He left several 100,000 words worth of material, thousands of photographs, um, lots of ephemera in the form of receipts and other kind of merchandise and material.
I can't even imagine the things that, a longtime roadie, personal assistant, protector, as you call Mal, could amass.
And I should be fair, I didn't quite answer your question. So um, the reason why we were able to tell this story so frankly is because by the time I meet Gary and then later his sister Julie and the other members of the family, they had been used to this story for 40 plus years. There really weren't that many secrets left out there for them. They knew that their father was not a good husband, right? That this was not going to be a surprise to them. He died in the duplex owned by another woman in LA in 1976. So we really found that there were only a couple of instances where, to protect other people, we would elide, identity and identifying portions. But otherwise, um, it was really about telling the story as candidly and accurately as possible.
Hmm. Can you briefly, for anyone who's not read the book yet, explain how Mal comes to his end?
Well, sure. And I don't. It's hard to be brief about this. He lived this very large life. One of the misnomers about Mal Evans is that you know when the Beatles break up in 1969 and then begin to formally work toward dissolution in 1970, that in some way Mal was cast adrift. He continued to work for them, until his death. Mal worked on many of their solo albums. He had also produced Badfinger, with whom he had a top five international hit. He had also worked with worked on the Ringo album, and it had a cut that was included, one of his original compositions. So really, Mal was professionally in a semi-good place, but it was his personal life and choices that he had been making that caught up with him, namely this protracted 2-year separation from his family, with the exception of just a couple of days in 1975 when he was happened to be in London. Otherwise, Mal didn't really connect with them, and a lot of it had to do with the simple fact that his wife Lily had found him out. All of this concealment that he'd been carrying on, at that point for 12 years or so, simply disappeared, and Mal was left to face that. And it was really something quite perfunctory that was long overdue that caused Mal to go into his last tailspin, and that was when his wife announced that she was going to see a solicitor about maybe beginning divorce proceedings. And that's all it took, really. At that point, but probably for possibly even as long as 2 years, Mal began working toward what would end up being suicide by cop.
Now, at the time of his death, he was in the process of writing his own memoirs, correct?
And not only writing them, but he had completed them. He had laid out where he wanted photographs to be included, how they would be included, etc. They had gone through 2 cover designs. They were looking at a kind of summer 1976 release date, which would have been kind of interesting because, of course, Paul McCartney was in the middle of the Wings Over the World tour, so that would have timed out in an interesting fashion. But yeah, he had been writing them for several months at this point, and was complete. He had just done some revisions. But really, all of his excitement about that, it didn't matter, because to him, he had committed this cardinal sin and he was paying for it. And somehow, in his malaise, his depression, he had created this idea that he would no longer be able to see his kids. And that really exacerbated things.
So tell us about the rather long and strange journey Mal's manuscript and his papers take following his death, because if I remember correctly, his family doesn't see these materials until 1988, is it?
That's exactly right. And I think you'll appreciate this for the kind of forensic historical work that you've been doing so successfully over the years. And that is, there's kind of a forensic study, and this to me was the most interesting part of it. And I couldn't quite make it work, but I had this idea about beginning with the mystery and going backwards, and I never quite got the structure down. But what had happened is all of this material we were talking about, that Mal owned, fell into the hands almost immediately of the press, Grosset and Dunlap, and they carted it back to New York City, to their head offices, because they wanted to continue to try to pursue publication. There were a number of international complications that got in their way, so it wasn't as easy as they thought. In fact, just handling Mal's death was complicated because, he was a married British citizen who dies abroad, and so there were a number of complications. But the press, as I said, wasted no time in gathering the material. I was able to follow it from the bedroom where Mal died after the shootout with the police, which was really a one-sided shootout. They told him to put down the gun, and he raised it on purpose to get them to kill him. I was able to trace all of the material from that space across the United States to the offices in New York City, where they had the Grosset and Dunlap offices were in the New York Life building. And that's where they sat, and eventually were taken to a basement storeroom. And we probably would not have them if it weren't for a wonderful Estonian immigrant who discovered them. She was doing a temp job and found them and thought, this looks important. She was only there for a week. They were cleaning out the storage unit. This was in that age when all of the presses and the publishers were sort of collapsing into one giant conglomerate, right? And they'd been purchased by Putnam's. And her job was to throw everything out. They were moving to a new office uptown that was probably cheaper. And she couldn't get any traction with the press. She said, this material looks important. It looks rare. She went to the New York Public Library over the Lincoln Center branch, I believe, and she did some research and she discovered that Mal had died in 1976, that he'd worked for the Beatles. She recognized all these Beatles photos. And to her, this was a mission on behalf of this fellow who had lost his legacy, right? She was able to figure out through her own good offices that this material really should be in the hands of Mal's children, who had very little in the way of information or mementos from their father. And when she wasn't getting any traction, and you have to love this, she just marched uptown to the Dakota. She left a note for Yoko, Ono, and Yoko did right by her old friend. And in just quick succession, she had the Apple lawyers kick into being. They happened to be across the street at the time, and maybe still are, from the New York Life Building. And they marched over there and they said, we're here for our stuff. It's as simple as that. And they made sure that the copyrights and all of the ownership reverted to Mal. They made Mal's estate, rather. They insisted that Grosset, now Putnam's, promised never to publish it, that belonged to, the Evans estate. It was really masterfully done, which reminds us why good lawyering is so important. The Apple lawyers really acquitted themselves well. They were working at the instruction of Mal's counterpart back in the Apple days and back in the roadie days, Neil Aspinall, who also was doing a solid by his old friend. But it was very wonderful for me to discover Yoko's philanthropic part in this story, because she's been so unfairly maligned over the years and blamed, for something that these other very strong personalities authored, which was the breakup of the Beatles. And it was wonderful to see her get some nice coverage for a change.
I loved it when I was reading it and I got to the Yoko. I gasped. I was like, Yoko, oh, this is a story. This is fascinating. Because of course I love the lives that our archival records have.
Sure, and then there's that great moment later when Yoko meets with Mal and Gary and his mother, and they have they have an embrace. It's quite meaningful. It really had come full circle.
To me, I enjoyed, and of course I'm biased, but I enjoyed the story of the archival record, the historical record here, and how you put it together as much as I enjoyed the biography. And speaking of all of the tremendous work you put into this biography, there's the archival record, but then you also conducted hundreds of interviews, I read. Tell me about this. How did you decide who you were going to interview, and what does the future hold for those interviews?
So it's been a strange project, and I think you'll appreciate this given your work. Completely unique in the sense that because Gary was able to provide me with this legacy that that the temp worker had saved back in 1988, much of what I needed was right there. I'm not used to this, right? I'm used to having to, put on my deerstalker cap and really hunt things down, right? When it came to whom do I need to talk to, Mal left lists and lists and lists of names, people he would refer to, and literally lists at times, but also in other cases, simply names that he would drop in his diaries or in his manuscripts. And so the first thing I did was write down all of those names and try to find out who's still with us and who isn't. And it meant that I had to cut across a number of different kinds of worlds, right? I had to call folks in the publishing world, Beatle world, post Beatles world. Mal worked with many acts for Apple, so I had to talk to those folks individually. And it was quite stimulating on the one hand, but exhaustive on the other. And most everyone was thrilled and ready to talk about Mal Evans. I mean, he had fans everywhere, whether it was Peter Frampton, who loved him, or Mal's family, who hadn't had a chance to tell about Mal's childhood before, to speak about those moments. It was an exciting experience to go and learn as much as I possibly could. There's a sadness to the story too, though, of course, because by ending his life in the way that he did, and by the way, one of the earliest things Gary said to me, I just remembered it now, and it's so moving, was that his heart broke that his father used the police in that way, that he would set them up to do something that, has to leave a mark, right? And breaks their hearts too. And that really told me that Gary was a guy I wanted to work with. But in any event, it was exciting to see all the folks who wanted to talk about Mal, who were finally able to tell their Mal Evans stories.
You just referenced Mal's lists. Did you feel like Mal was almost your collaborator in some ways on this book?
I do, and I attribute that to a remark that Ringo Starr had made sometime in 74 or 75, around the time that Mal and his girlfriend at the time, Fran, had started to hatch this idea. It was Fran who thought Mal should tell his story. Everybody else was. She had seen an article about Norman Mailer and the run up to his book about Marilyn Monroe. And he had worked with Harold Lipton and some other folks out in California. And she thought, well, this is great. Mal should work with Harold Lipton too, and she really got things off the ground for him. But when they talked to Ringo, Ringo said, if you're going to do this, you need to tell the truth. If you're going to write this, you need to be honest. And Mal was, and the person he was most honest about and had the license to be the most honest about was him. And so what Gary and I discovered as we looked closer and closer at this materials, and I was able to ferret out a number of stories that the family didn't know, but what we discovered is Mal was already sort of creating this warts and all approach, right? This warts and all approach to how to tell his story. He was the one he was exposing in these tales. He wasn't holding back on how bad he felt about himself for his appetites and the things that he would do. So I think you're absolutely right. In that sense, you bet. My collaborator, in addition to Gary, who looks so much like Mal, I accidentally call him Mal quite often.
I was struck by something you just said, that Ringo says, if you're going to do this, it was Ringo, right, who said, if you're going to do this, you have to do it honestly. One might think that the boys, as Mal calls them, right, would be seeking injunctions. They wouldn't want Mal writing a book. They'd be terrified about the stories he could tell. That wasn't the case?
It wasn't. And they had all endorsed his work. They had endorsed an original manuscript he had written in 1965. And again, in 75, he wanted their endorsements before he went forward, and they all readily provided them. They're quite humorous. Paul says, make sure people know how lovely I am. But no, I don't think they necessarily had that kind of fear. So much has been written, I've always had the sense that they don't have that kind of fear. The Beatles lived obviously this kind of rock and roll lifestyle, and it was raucous at times, to be sure. But they certainly weren't Led Zeppelin or The Who, right? or something of this nature. So, and John Lennon had been speaking frankly throughout much of the 1970s, right, about the Beatles story. And, he said at times it was Caligula, right? I mean, he was quite open about that. So Mal simply was filling in the blanks in terms of his own role in that world.
Okay. Now, the Beatles are still releasing new music, right? Now and then.
They had a #1 hit last year. Yeah.
They just continue to have such this strong following, right? There's all kinds of Beatles conferences and symposia and fan gatherings that are still packing them in. Why, and your book, right, is just selling in droves. Why is there such an appetite for ever more Beatles content?
I was speaking yesterday with Darius Rucker, right, Hootie and the Blowfish, for my own podcast yesterday, and he was really upset because USA Today had published a list, and the Beatles weren't the #1 album, was not Abbey Road, it was #3, and he said that's just wrong. He said they are, the best thing to ever happen to music. It's not going to change. I liken it to a kind of big bang, right? Even if you're not influenced by the Beatles, you're influenced by the Beatles because of the echoes through time and space. I think that people come back to them in the same way we talked about when we started tonight. Kids hear them and they're just blown away by the sounds, the songs, the inventiveness. It is unique. It has a character that's all its own. It's interesting. And this is complimentary, by the way, but so please accept it that way. We're also proud of Mr. Springsteen and him trusting our university and good folks like you with the repository. When I teach the Springsteen course, students take it because they want to know more about this guy from Jersey, right? They're New Jersey natives in a lot of cases, and I love this, they want to be close to their parents, right?
Or grandparents in some cases.
Yeah, let's be honest, or their grandparents. Yeah, that's probably more accurate at this point. And it's really quite moving, right? I mean, it makes me feel good that they think in those terms. When they take the Beatles, they take it for themselves.
Mm.
They have their own spark that was lit in just the same way that it so often is, and thousands of kids, while we've been talking, young and old, have heard the Beatles for the first time, and they've probably had the same thought I did, which is, where has this been? How did I miss them for 11 years, right? I mean, I hadn't completely missed them. You can't completely miss them. I'd heard songs over the years, but in some of my darkest times, I've literally thought to myself, and maybe you've had similar feelings about music or art, things are rough right now, but I've got the Beatles.
Mm. Well, Ken, I have so enjoyed my time asking questions, but I don't want to be selfish. So let me turn it over to the audience. Audience, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. I like to keep it informal here. Or if you are more comfortable, please feel free to type it in the chat and I will read it for you. So I see Lorraine's camera coming back on. Lorraine, do you want to be our
Lorraine is
first
not
question?
shy.
Well, as I think both of you know, can you hear me okay? I'm a psychologist, and I guess I didn't realize this was going to be a psychology talk. And I really got into some of the details and just the themes. And here's the question I want to ask, and tell me if this is too broad. How is it that some people, and we don't need to name names, but if you want, you can, if you can think of some, how is it that some people don't succumb to what you called, the rock and roll lifestyle? And because this story is very tragic. I mean, this is a very tragic story amidst all the glamour and everything. And yeah, the band had infighting and stuff. But this is a pretty tragic story. What do you think allows some people to immerse in that rock and roll world and not? And I mean, not like what that for everybody, but do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, Melissa referred to the many symposia and conferences that we've done at Monmouth. One of them in feels like recent years, but it isn't, was the White Album Conference in 1919. Wow, 2018. I don't know where I was going with that. Anyway, in 2018, and our speaker was the eminent Beatles historian, Mark Lewison. And he kind of talked about this, about just the different constitutions that people have, right? I mean, it's such a complicated world and large world when we talk about what shapes us as human beings, et cetera. And Mark was referencing, he was talking about 1968, obviously, because the White Album was produced that year. And just the habits of the Beatles. And one of the ones that he talked about was that John Lennon's well-known drug usage, right? His constitution was very different than his songwriting partner, right? John Lennon would do the same drugs Paul would do, and he could be out for 2 or 3 days, and completely useless. And Paul McCartney could be at the studio the next morning at 7 a.m. and would be every day ready to go. And it's about I think it is psychological. It is about our constitutions. It's about, add in a percentage for how a person's raised. Mal wanted to see the world. He had his own hang-ups about his past. He was very upset when he wasn't selected for conscription, for example, in the armed forces. He was this giant guy who trained, and it was basically a technicality that kept him from being able to serve. So I think that was in there somewhere. And so when the chance came to see the world with the Beatles, to find out what was going to happen with them, right? Because this is not a settled question when Mal joins them permanently in August 1963 in a full-time basis. It could be that thing that everyone feared back in those days, and that horrid phrase that many parents said to their kids: they're going to be a flash in the pan, right? Going to be a flash in the pan. And Mal wanted to see the world, wanted to see what was going to happen, and he lived every aspect of the Beatles story. Whereas others, right, who also traveled with them, could keep a kind of distance, sometimes a journalistic distance. But so much of it goes back to our Constitution, right? I mean, other folks might have weathered the storm of his marriage and his role in tearing it apart much better than Mal did. Mal wasn't able to do that. I do think he'd been ideating suicide probably for 2 years at that point. It was pure happenstance that Mal's wife Lily found out about his new life in LA. She thought he was just doing his usual traveling back and forth, and he presented it that way, that he would be. But it was John's ex-wife, Cynthia, was staying with him, and Julian Lennon was there. And they said when they were in LA riding the teacups with Mal at Disneyland, that they had seen their cousin. And of course, Lily knew they didn't have a cousin in LA. But, a lot of that psychology is germane here. Why Mal's need for concealment, the way he lived his life in compartments, and of course, the danger psychologically of living in those compartments is what happens when they collide.
Yeah.
And people don't care.
And let me just ask this, and again, I haven't read the book. Were they surprised at the suicide? Did people get the idea that he had been sort of on that road for a little bit?
They were completely surprised.
Completely surprised.
Like John Lennon, who was distraught. I spoke to the fellow who picked up the phone when John called the next day saying, "What the hell is happening out in LA?"
Okay.
He had only spoken to Mal 2-3 days earlier, and he was crushed, and he didn't want to believe it. And in fact, there's still folks who will write to me and say I'm wrong, that he was killed by the LA police on purpose, and it wasn't suicide by I have emails from folks. And I think part of it is that Mal was so jovial and larger than life. Fans across the country and the world remember seeing Mal bring in the instruments, and they knew who he was thanks to Beatles fan publications, and they would scream his name, and cheer him on. And I guess the truth is we never know really what really lives in another person's heart, right? And Mal's a good reminder about that. So, people still want to deny it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a
Thanks for your
question?
question.
Oh.
Sure, go ahead.
Is
Hi.
that Arlen?
Ken, it's Arlen.
Hey, I thought so.
Hey, I got here late. I'm sorry. Hi, I want to just add to the Mal story. He was a kid who joined the circus. And when the circus comes to an end, and the kids have to face, in a sense, the adult world. And I think balancing his art was the Beatles' life. And the stress of balancing a family life with your art, and I speak from experience, my own story, but the bottom line is not everybody can handle that balance and that pressure. And I think that factors into it.
That's really well said, Arlen, especially the idea about the circus, right?
Yeah.
I've heard Depeche Mode's lead singer, Martin L. Gore, speak about their tours. Even today, they are these circuses, right? Suddenly they're playing Madison Square Garden for 3 nights. And, the cacophony, the entourage, the whole business, and how difficult it is to get off the road. And, I mean, Mal made no bones about that. He said, I couldn't get enough of it. He said they were better than food or drink.
And can you blame him if every one of us Beatles fans were faced with that crossroads, Robert Johnson type decision where if you know your life is going to come to a tragic end, do you want to join the Beatles? Or maybe not in those severe terms, but my point is, how many of us might have taken that life if you don't necessarily know it's going to have a tragic end? I think that's a better situation to put people in. And I think there would have been many Mal Evans had Mal Evans not been Mal Evans.
I take your point, and I do think there's a truth to that. Mal did not have the Constitution to resist it. And I think you're probably right. Most people wouldn't, right? I mean, if you could get everything you want with this, band
exactly
you're obsessed with.
People would have taken the Mal Evans life and dealt with the consequences later, which is a metaphor for life in general. That's what happens. Okay, that's my one point about Mal Evans. My other point, since we share our love of Bruce Springsteen, Bruce was just given a songwriting award in England by Paul McCartney. I think it just happened yesterday or something. And the connection, of course, between Bruce and the Beatles is profound. I think Bruce is the greatest body of American rock and roll, and the Beatles are the greatest body of English rock and roll. But that aside, don't you find it interesting, Ken, that Bruce has only covered one Beatles song in his entire performing career, not including the George Harrison benefit? I think he's only done Tell Me Why in Atlantic City in one of the early 2000 tours, 2002, 2009. Twist and Shout is not really a Beatles cover because he does it more like La Bamba. But I've always found it interesting, as much as the Beatles affected Bruce, and I know he was affected by the British invasion that followed, maybe more, but the point is, I always found it fascinating in concerts starting from 1972, he's never covered a Beatles song. And then out of nowhere, he does Tell Me Why in Atlantic City. So as a Beatles and a Bruce expert as you are, why do you think that is?
I couldn't begin to tell you, other than, of course, as you know, he's never made any bones about how important they are to him. We all
That's
know
my point.
The heartbreaking moment, December 9th, 1980, when he went on stage at the
Absolutely.
Spectrum. I mean,
Absolutely.
that just crushes you, to listen to.
But even then, he didn't even cover a Lennon song or even a Beatles. I'm just saying,
Yeah, it's
Bruce-
interesting. I don't have the first clue about it.
Yeah. I mean, Bruce
in
was
a
fascinating.
way,
Yeah,
it is fascinating, but in a way, I mean, they resonate. I was talking about the Big Bang, right, earlier. Resonate in his music, right? I mean, he is one of the many, Steve Van Zandt can always tell us more about this, who were profoundly affected by this band that wrote their own songs, and the idea of authorship and composition, and playing the guitar was too much to resist. So
but then,
that's a great point.
but then, like I said, for them
Hey,
not to actually
Hey,
cover-
Arlen,
Yeah.
there's a line growing behind you, bud.
There's a what? Oh, I'm
There's a
sorry.
line growing behind you.
Okay,
Other people
I'm
can
sorry.
ask questions.
Hey,
Okay.
everybody play nice. Everybody play nice. Arlen, are you good?
I'm done. Well,
Seeing you, Arlen.
now I'm done. I'm sorry if I went on too long.
Arlen
Cool.
has a great book coming out soon. Good seeing you.
Thank
Um,
you, Ken.
Thanks for your questions, Arlen. Okay, go ahead.
I'm from New Jersey. That was me being nice. Okay.
Ah,
Anyway, Ken, you and I I believe, had breakfast maybe only a couple of days after that box came to you from Mal's family. And
That's right.
I remember you saying, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe what's in here." And I remember you saying, "Where do I begin with this?" And I guess my question to you would be, since, I have read most of the book, it's so well laid out. How did you start to compartmentalize the voluminous evidence, which, if I heard you correctly, you haven't even gone through all of it yet? That was, so I know there's more to come on the Mal story, but how do you approach such an overwhelming volume and then make it into the narrative you did? I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's no one has asked me that. That's a great question. And what I did was I put on my scholarly cap and I organized the thing, right? I made sure that I knew what we were looking at. So I built out a web design, in my own Dropbox so that I could start organizing things. All those names we talked about earlier, Melissa, I created a folder for each name so that I could gather information, find out where people lived, get their phone numbers and email addresses so I could start contacting them. And I started just building out the Mal collection. I took the photographs and I merged them into a large file. There's still a lot of work left to do there. I also had a great benefit from the university in terms of student support. So we're in COVID and people need things to do, right? So we had a new student at that time, Carly Migley-Reese, who works with the Springsteen Archives. And Carly, she got in contact and she said, "I want to work on a Beatles project. What do you got?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing this, and Mal." She said, "Forget it. I want to work on Big Mal." There you go. So she worked on it. And then we had 5 graduate students from English who were lured. I think we can all enjoy this. They were lured by the promise that what they were working on was top secret. They loved it. So they transcribed Mal's diaries. They transcribed Mal's 3 different manuscripts. There was all this work that was being done. And of course, they were earning money for their assistantships, which was good for everybody. I really, what I did, Mike, was I created a taxonomy, so that I could understand what this thing looked like, because at some point I'm going to have to start writing it. My agent identified a press pretty early on. They had an exclusive, so that part wasn't going to be, this kind of raging challenge. The thing that I think has helped me is the fact that there is a book 2 that you alluded to. I knew that the things I didn't need for the story could wait until later. There was a challenge in terms of all of those interviews. So, those were too much for my students to transcribe. So I hired a transcription service so that I could create a database. And when I needed a quote, instead of, as we all know, right, Melissa, pulling my hair out, trying to find a quote, I could do a search and it would be there in an instant. So it was a way of digitizing all that audio. But it was simply a matter of organization, right? Sitting back and saying, okay, I've got to make sense of this thing or it'll never happen. But you were right. And I remember that breakfast now. I was really flummoxed. I wasn't sure. I thought I had a handle on it until that material arrived. I figured I think I told you these exact words. I can write 80,000 words on this guy. That's not going to be a problem, but where will I get the detail? And that was cleared up pretty fast.
Unprocessed archival material is both an absolute treasure and terrifying, right? To bring order to it. So I definitely empathize with you there. Here's a question in the chat. Did you get to speak with Paul and Ringo as part of your research?
I didn't. I did send, notes to their representatives to let them know, if they want to speak, they can. As well, I'm going to be speaking to the converted here, right? I mean, you would love to talk to folks like that, but there's the challenge of memories. And they certainly have had their memories fade like all of ours do over time. So I wasn't sure how useful it would be. And lo and behold, I mean, I spoke to at least 100, maybe more people than that, probably more, maybe closer to 200. And there were many folks whom I was getting great testimony from, right? Great memories, etc. But you then have to go and corroborate them, right? And often they're a little off. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They remembered something, but then this other thing didn't quite fit. So you have to go fix their memory. You said these 3 people were there, but I know that 2 of them weren't.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have to elide their comments, gently edit their comments to make sure that I'm speaking to the truth. And that's the painstaking nature of scholarship, right? Right, Melissa?
It's so fascinating. You also write fiction. Do you feel like when you're writing a novel, is it a break from the painstaking research that goes into your scholarly work, or how do you see that? Does it just kind of fill a different?
Yeah, I'm fortunate to teach in our graduate creative writing program, and we talk a lot about the process of writing, etc. And at this point, I really don't mind what it is. I just like being in that world. You just published a book. Congratulations. Right? You miss that world when it's gone. Whether it's nonfiction or fiction, you have to build it out. You're building pieces that don't exist, right, anymore, or you have to go find them and make them become real or seem more real. So I think it's frankly, they're not that far afield from each other. In either case, you have to keep track of the moving parts. If you make a change on page 650, it will cascade across the entire manuscript, right? And if it's fiction, you have to make sure you arrive there in the right way to create the proper effect for the text. Not that much different from nonfiction. If you make a discovery about something, and we do often during the writing of a project, it has that cascading effect. And I was just saying to one of our colleagues very recently, how did people write before the age of the word processor? I can't imagine, my favorite novel, which I'm going to teach in a summer course here in a couple of weeks, is The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. And it is eminently complicated. I don't know how you keep those balls in the air and write it out longhand, as Ford did, and then have to go through successive drafts. The amount of concentration, I think, is frightening.
Well, your concentration levels obviously are firing on all cylinders, Ken. This has been a great chat. We are just about out of time, so we will end it there. Everyone, I want to encourage you to go out and get Ken's book. And I can tell you there are more exciting things coming from Ken in the near future. You want to tease any of those or not yet?
Gosh, what are they?
I'm thinking about September. What did we talk about for September? Can we say that?
Oh, are you discussing the book that I wrote with the great Mr. Ken Campbell?
I am. You want to tease
Oh,
that?
yeah. Very proud of that. Ken and I just went through another round of proofs. That is our book, Bruce Songs, which is a journey across his story, and all those great songs that both Ken and I are privileged to teach at Monmouth.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to go out, you're going to get Mal Evans, and you're going to stay tuned because we're going to have Ken Womack with our other colleague, Ken Campbell, back in the fall to talk about their new.
That's a lot of Ken in one place.
You can never have enough Kens from Monmouth. All right,
there he is.
Thank you so much, everybody. And again, please keep in touch. It's springsteenarchives.org. Thanks, Ken. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.